Hello, everyone. Welcome. So glad that you are all here. We have such a great group today, and I'm so excited that we get to hear from the Elkhorn Slough Foundation, from Mark Silberstein and Taylor Honrath about their recent, very successful capital campaign. So, Mark, my name is Sharon Papo. Her pronouns. I'm the CEO of Indigo Skies Consulting. I'm one of the coordinators of the Development Roundtable and Executive Director Roundtable. And again, so glad you are all here. So, Mark and Taylor, can you please share an overview of the work of the Elkhorn Slough Foundation, ESF, and why you decided to launch a capital campaign?
Yeah, well, Taylor and I hope you can hear me. I had surgery on my vocal cord, so this hoarse voice is what I got. And I apologize in advance for you not hearing more dulcet tones. But can you all hear me at this level? Yeah, good. Um, I think just as an overview, the Elkhorn Slough Foundation was established in 1982, and the couple of roles that we play, one is as a partner with the Elkhorn Slough National Estuarine Research Reserve, which is one of 30 of these reserves around the country. And so the nonprofit works closely with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife that manages the reserve property here on Elkhorn Slough. We administer, the nonprofit administers state and federal funds that come into the reserve outside of the standard department funding. And we employ about 15 people who work on the reserve. The other function that the foundation plays is a land trust. So in the Elkhorn watershed, the foundation owns about 4,200 acres of land outside the boundaries of the state federal reserve. So we've worked very hard to protect the watershed and the ecological integrity of the Elkhorn Slough system. So that's kind of our raison d'etre. In terms of why we decided to launch a capital campaign, um, in the 40 years, it had maybe been 37 or 38 years before we launched the campaign, we'd always had significant funding coming in from grants and from our membership, from other sources of revenue. We have farms and ranches that are leased out as some of the revenue streams. We'd never done a capital campaign. And the trigger, there were two triggers. One was that a very generous board member challenged us with $1 million challenge. The other is that, almost coincident with that, we lost a property, a key property that we were pursuing, by just a couple of days because we didn't have cash on hand to do the transaction. And it was a situation where we had to move quickly. And so those two things converged, and we realized that number one, we had an opportunity. Number two, we had a need to have a pool of funds that could be mobilized quickly to work at the speed of real estate, so that kind of loss never happened again. So those were sort of two of the elements that came into place when we decided to pursue this idea.
Thank you. And thank you for protecting one of my favorite places in the county, in the world. It's such a sacred, special place. And really hearing how there was both this opportunity, good and awful, where you said, which also gave you a really powerful story to tell during your campaign that was also very inspiring for people about why it was so important. It was just really clear and concise about why this campaign was needed. You conducted a feasibility and planning study before you launched your campaign. Can you share why you decided to do one and what you learned?
Yeah, Mark alluded to this, Sharon, a few moments ago, a few of the reasons. One, we'd never done a campaign before as an organization, as staff, and we had this very generous gift, challenge gift from a board member to raise at least an additional $2 million to match the one that he'd pledged. And we wanted to honor that pledge in the best way that we could. We also didn't really have a sense of how much we could feasibly raise during a campaign like this. We thought maybe $5 to $7 million, and that was the number that we ended up testing during the feasibility study. And Sharon and Nancy Lushkajan conducted our feasibility study, and they came back to us, and one of the recommendations was that we were probably being a little too modest with our goal. We thought maybe 7 million on the high end. Sharon and Nancy said you really should be thinking about a $10 million goal, which, was a bit frightening to say the least. When I heard that, I was like, you got to be kidding me, like $10 million, come on. But um, we leaned into their wisdom, and we initially tested a $10 million goal. We ended up launching the campaign with a $12 million goal and raised just over 13, which concluded back in September of last year. So the feasibility study really was an investment that paid substantial dividends and continues to. It gave us a great deal of insight into our donor base, into how we should conduct a campaign, into the steps that we needed to take before we even launched. There were many things that we hadn't really contemplated as important ingredients in the mix that we needed to accomplish and complete before we even launched. And the study really set us up for success.
Thank you for sharing that. You had a really excellent volunteer capital campaign committee. Can you talk about how you engaged your volunteers during the campaign and how they supported your success?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to that. I can squeak to that. Um, but, I would add to the previous question that, and this is really kind of an index of our lack of experience. We never done a campaign like this. And so the kind of wisdom that Sharon and Nancy brought to us, that the two of you, Sharon, kind of gave us a little capital campaign 101 education. And so you talked about the three phases of these campaigns, sort of the the friends and family phase, the quiet phase, and the public phase. And so I think for us, just getting educated about the mechanics of doing something like this was really important. And I think that having gone through that process, that put us in a position to approach volunteers, very capable volunteers. We had we had three co-chairs on the committee. Two of them were former board members of the Elkhorn Slough Foundation, and they had worked together. The third was a very good friend of one of the one of the other volunteers. So the three of them knew each other. They'd worked together. They already had a demonstrated commitment to the mission and to the work of the foundation. At least two of them kind of knew some of the inside workings of the machinery of the nonprofit. And so the the other the other key element is that we approached the former board member, one of the former board members first, and he said that he would only do it if we got person number two to join. And so we had to leverage that. And so we told person number two, look, here's this great person. He won't do it unless you do it. And that worked. And then the third person came on because we had two outstanding people co-leading the volunteer campaign committee. And so, everything's fair in love, war, and fundraising. And so that was a combination of those three elements. But it was, I can't overestimate how important it was to have those kinds of community leaders throwing in with us. And they worked hard. So these were not just figureheads. These folks really worked hard through a lot of meetings. And so that was how that unfolded.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I want to underscore something that you said about the phases of the campaign. And I think it's really important that folks understand that there is a map to success for campaigns. It's not totally random, right? They're best practices, and you followed them. And I'm so glad that you had so much success. Um, can you talk about how you approached donor stewardship and relationship building to ensure long-term support beyond the campaign?
Yeah, this process really began before the campaign. I joined the organization in 2019, and we already had a very robust fundraising operation in place. And we sort of kickstarted it and took it to the next level by really engaging donors more thoughtfully, hosting more events, but also doing more frequent check-ins. So Mark and I would sit down, we'd make phone calls to donors, and sometimes folks didn't have time and wouldn't get a chance to connect. But then the pandemic hit, and everybody was home, and people were craving human connection in their isolation as we were all sheltering in place. And all of a sudden, we're having conversations with people who before wouldn't make the time for us, and we'd be talking for an hour, hour and a half, and these people ended up becoming substantial donors to the campaign. I think it really comes down to treating people, right? Like folks who have means and even people who have more modest means, they don't want to feel like ATM machines. They want to feel like they're valued far more than their capacity to give. And each of us has much more to give than just money. And so we would seek people's counsel, we'd seek their advice, we'd invite them out to go kayaking, to go for a hike, a picnic. We tried to make the experience with us memorable in ways that we would want folks to, make something memorable for us if we were on the receiving end of what they knew was going to be an ask, but we didn't want to treat it as something quite so transactional.
Yeah, thank you. You really sounds like you created really wonderful experiences, but you also really built authentic relationships. You really put a lot of time into, because at the end of the day, right, people give to people. And so you had really developed a lot of trust as well as made a really powerful case about what this campaign was going to accomplish. Can you share memorable moments, maybe some milestones or achievements during the course of the campaign? Both, and please share, the good and then, we'd love to.
Taylor and I talked about this, and I debated, but I'll share with you one of the literal and figurative low points. Taylor said that we take people out on boat rides, and I think that whatever it is that your mission is, you want to be able to share that, whether it's meeting with students or patients or clients, or if it's a building, whatever it is, that's pretty critical. And so at Elkhorn Slough, it's about the land and the water, the wildlife. And so we did a series of boat trips with people. There's a small little electric boat that plies the waters of Elkhorn Slough. And a couple who I've known for a good long time, and I have great affection for. We invited them out on a boat ride, and the fellow was on oxygen. His health was poor. They were elderly, but it's a very comfortable boat. It's got a little canopy. So we started up Elkhorn Slough. It was a perfect day. The tide was ebbing. There was a lot of birds out, wildlife. And the captain of the boat is somebody that I knew. I didn't know him that well. the boat typically goes part way up Elkhorn Slough and then turns around. And on that day, because I wanted to show these potential donors one of the properties that we were looking at, I encouraged the captain to go a little further up the slough beyond where he had been before. And it was perfect, beautiful. We saw the property. He started turning the boat. We got stuck on the mudflat, and the tide was ebbing, and the clients were elderly. I was with one of the campaign.
Yeah. Recommend me. Okay, I am. I have a whole page of things I'm going to endorse on Tony's.
Maybe a mute. So one of the campaign co-chairs was with me, and I called Moss Landing Marine Labs. I said, "Can you come up here and help?" I called one of our volunteers who was in Santa Cruz. He was too far away to come and get us in a boat. Moss Landing Marine Labs came, and we were able to, at the last minute, offload the donors and the campaign co-chair before the boat was totally stuck. And so I stayed with the captain, and we were kind of stuck. But then the volunteer I'd called earlier came out, picked us up, brought us back. We met the donors. The board chair had taken the donors to lunch at our wonderful restaurant in Moss Landing. And by the time I got there, they had finished, but they were on their second margarita. Everything was okay. And that night, I went home and I wrote them a song that I performed, sang to them, and sent them a little email about the adventure, sort of a la, whatever that TV show was, Gilligan's Island. They came back. They had a sense of humor. They came back with a six-figure gift. And so I guess the message is, other than Mark is an idiot, is that don't stop, that you want to approach this stuff with a sense of humor, and you can even pull these gifts out of the mud. So that was the low point. I'll let Taylor maybe talk about high points.
But before you do, I just want to say I love that story, and it's so important to know that even when things seem off track, right? It's so much about the relationship, and you kept that, and that song you wrote was amazing. I just want to say, right? And you made something that could have turned a lot of ways into a really memorable thing that y'all laughed about. So beautiful. Taylor, please.
Oh, yeah, but that's a hard act to fall, even if it is the low point. But the high point was probably, I think, for me, the celebration event we hosted at the aquarium. Julie Packard very generously donated use of the facility for us, and we invited out the donors, the board, the committee, everybody who had a hand in this, Sharon and Nancy, and we got so much positive feedback in response to that event. All of our staff was there. It really felt like a great celebration befitting the effort.
That was really fun. Celebrate.
Absolutely. I think we often don't celebrate enough in our work, and that was a great celebration. And right, it feels like everyone's celebration, right? Everyone who was part of it, it felt like this collective accomplishment, which is really beautiful. Can you share what were your biggest lessons learned? This was your first campaign. It was wildly successful, but I'm sure you learned a lot. Can you share some of those learnings?
Yeah, and I'll start. We did the feasibility study. Sharon and Nancy performed it for us and did an outstanding job. And I'd say we followed about 95% of it. One of the things that we didn't do is we didn't add much in the way of staffing capacity and development. We figured like, oh, we could do it with the existing staff. And in hindsight, we probably should have added more staff, only because, this is an all hands on deck effort. And there were many times where it felt like, oh man, if there were one more person that we could lean on and, hand this off to, because in addition to the campaign, you're doing everything you're normally doing in your role, right? It's not like you just get to focus on the campaign and everything else is on pause. Um, the other thing I'd say kind of goes back to what we were talking about just a second ago is celebrating more. During the campaign, it can feel like, oh yeah, this gift came in and that's great and it's transformational, but There's still so much more left to do. It's easy to lose sight of the fact that it's important to celebrate each of the wins, big or small, because it really is a marathon. It's not a sprint. And if you don't celebrate each of the milestones, you don't get to enjoy the ride as much along the way, but it also replenishes the tank when you do celebrate. I don't know if you want to add anything more.
Yeah, no, celebrate early and often.
Yeah. So every campaign has times when it feels like it's stalling, right? There are times that you're still working and you're still working and gifts aren't coming in. How did you navigate through those times? What kept you going and kept your hopes up when you didn't have the momentum for a while?
Yeah, I don't know if you have thoughts on
Alcohol? I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Sort of. Um, no, it honestly, it's an opportunity to learn patience. And for someone like me who always isn't as patient as I'd like to be, it really was a very valuable lesson because these things can't be forced. You're operating on other people's timetable, and that's okay. Um, but part of it too is also giving yourself grace, and giving yourself more runway than you probably think you need at the front end so that you don't feel like you're running up against deadlines. You don't feel like you're running out of time. We established a very firm end date with the campaign for ourselves, and that was always looming in the back of my mind. In the future, maybe I'd leave it a little more fluid.
and I think that's one of the lessons is that I have no doubt we would have raised a lot more money had we extended the timeline. But there are these intersecting curves of energy. We were leaning a lot on the committee, the volunteers, and so those kind of parameters are ones that you have to think about. The other aspect is this is that once you enter the public phase, and I take my hat off to the Santa Cruz Museum for being 86% of the way towards that stupendous goal. But once you make a public announcement, there's a lot of pressure to meet that goal. You want to be thoughtful about setting that. You don't want to fall short. It's okay if you exceed it, but you don't want to fall short. And so those were kind of elements that influenced the timing and the amount of money that we raised. And so those are the kind of elements that that you think about during the three phases of the campaign and during the quiet phase when you're gathering kind of the bulk of the donors. You have to decide how long you want this to go and how much energy you have to extend it. But I think those were some of the things that I thought about as we reached the goal.
And there was a question from Susan about the timeline, how long it took you to do your campaign from beginning to end.
It's like 3.5 years.
Yeah, it was about like 3.5 years, but that includes the feasibility study.
I think that the first phase, the Elkhorn Slough Foundation Board of Directors stepped up in what Sharon and Nancy called the friends and family phase, where those closest to the mission make a commitment. And I think that the board and kind of our immediate family stepped up with about $3 million, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we started the quiet phase with $3 million in funds or pledges that we could then go to donors in the quiet phase. And, Sharon, you might be able to answer, like thinking about if there are set ratios, like if you only raise, a smaller amount during the friends and family phase, does that constrain the other phases? But anyway, we started out with generous contributions and commitments from the board and from our immediate crew.
And I'll share that not every board has the capacity to give what, some boards can give more than others. So it's lovely if your board can get you 20% of the way there. Some can't, some can get you more, some can get you far less. And so, of course, it's lovely if they can, but it certainly doesn't mean that you can't have a successful campaign if they don't. What's most important is that every board member makes a personally meaningful gift so that everyone is in. So I'd like you to talk about burnout. Before I became a consultant, I was an executive director, and after I did 2 campaigns, I left. As Taylor said, didn't hire enough staff. Really pushed so hard, and just the burnout rate is really high. What can you share advice? Taylor, you mentioned making sure you have enough staff, but any other pieces of advice that are important for folks on listening to this to know as they're thinking about their campaigns to sustain them?
I mean, there's so many different factors, of course, that go into this, but I think, recruiting staff that are talented, of course, and capable, but also people that you want to work with, right? You have to have that sort of, collegial relationship. And I think, I've been at Elkhorn Slough for 7 years now. It's the best place I've ever worked. And that's really due in large part to the fact that, the people that I work with are wonderful people. They're talented, they're committed, they're in it for all the right reasons. I also love the slough, so it just works out really well. But that's one of the key factors, I think, are the people you're working with, but also going in clear-eyed. You don't want to start one of these processes only to have to backpedal and restart. And that's where I think working with people who know what they're doing is very effective and meaningful. So hiring folks like Sharon and Nancy to really lead the effort and to validate the enthusiasm that staff might have where board members may be cautious or not as not as quick to jump in. That really wasn't the case for us. Our board was eager to get this going. But I can imagine for, other boards it might be frightening to contemplate undertaking a campaign and rightfully, it's a significant commitment. Um, but in terms of the team, in terms of the people that you're working with, getting the board ready, getting the right people in place, um, also making sure that you're leaving enough time for yourself. And as silly as the whole self-care thing sometimes feels to like beat that drum, I think it is true. We need to take care of ourselves and the people around us. That probably covers a lot of ground. I don't know. What do you think, Mark?
Yeah, Sharon and Nancy, like having consultants. I mean, you guys could sort of hold our hands when we entered challenging phases or when there was uncertainty or when the executive director made stupid mistakes. And having kind of an outside voice that can communicate with the board is something that I would not sell short. I mean, that really is, the board, we have a good relationship with the board, but if staff come with an idea to the board, if it's reinforced with independent voices, I think it can be more compelling. But in terms of burnout, I mean, I think that Taylor, Taylor worked really hard and he was doing the heavy lifting. And so I have to acknowledge that this was a lot of work. And so I think there's some irreducible amount of work. And I think that your point about the fact that we had a team of people who could help with this. And I suspect, and Sharon, you can comment on this, is that the ambitiousness of your goal has to track with the capacity you have to keep the machinery going and get the work done. So I think that's part of that assessment phase, that you have to assess that readiness so that you don't take on more than you can comfortably accomplish without burning out.
Yeah, well said. It's really wonderful to meet and exceed your goal, and it's hard not meet it, even if you've raised more money than you ever have before. So that's why the feasibility and planning study is such an important step to make sure that you have a plan that sets you on a road to success. I want to underscore something that was really the foundation of your successful campaign, which is that you had for years really invested time into building your organizational family. You had really put a lot of time into getting to know your donors. And because you had such these strong relationships to build on, when you launched your campaign and you had this big idea, you already had the trust and knew folks who you could tap for their concentric circles. And so I just want to share for people on the call, we're saying, how do we do this? How do we raise millions of dollars? And to say there's a lot of prep work, and it's not just strategy prep work, it's all the work you're doing to build these relationships and let people know this is the impact of your gift, and thank you so much, and in building that trust, that's all setting the foundation for campaigns like this. So I just want to say you all had done a phenomenal job, and thank you so much for pulling back the curtain and sharing what went on behind in your successful campaign. And I know there are many folks on this webinar and people will see this who will take this advice to heart to make wonderful things happen in the community. So if we can say thank you so much to Mark and Taylor, really appreciate you both. And to everyone who's here, just want to say thank you for making time. We have great things coming up. Check your emails. We're going to officially close.
Thank you, Sharon. And thanks to all of you for all the work you're doing all around the Bay Area. Bravo.